On October 25, 1970, a young woman lay dead inside her Sacramento apartment, just weeks before her wedding day. But the killer didn't leave empty-handed. He left behind something investigators almost never find. His own blood stained the scene, practically screaming his identity. Detectives believed the case would be solved within days. They couldn't have been more wrong. For the next 52 years, that single drop of blood became a cruel paradox. It held the answer to one of Sacramento County's oldest murder mysteries, yet no one could unlock it. Detectives retired. Families mourned. Science evolved. Meanwhile, the man who shed that blood quietly walked among unsuspecting neighbors, carrying a secret no one could prove. Then, more than half a century later, the evidence finally began to speak. But when investigators uncovered the name they had been chasing all along, they were met with one final, devastating twist. So who was he, and how had he managed to hide in plain sight for over 5 decades? Before we go any further, I'd like to ask one small favor. If you believe every victim deserves to be remembered, and every unanswered question deserves to be explored, please subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't just tell crime stories. We honor lives, examine the evidence, and revisit the cases that history tried to forget. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's return to the investigation. There are some murders that leave behind almost nothing. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no clear suspect. Cases where investigators spend decades hoping for just one lucky break. But this wasn't one of them. Because on a quiet October morning in Sacramento, California, a killer made what should have been a fatal mistake. He left behind something detectives dream of finding: his own blood. And yet, despite that extraordinary piece of evidence, he would disappear into ordinary life. He would go to work, walk the same streets, blend into the same neighborhoods, and for more than 50 years, no one would know his name. How could someone leave DNA at the scene of a murder and still evade justice for over half a century? That question would haunt generations of detectives. It would outlive the investigators who first stepped into the apartment. It would survive changes in forensic science, evolving investigative techniques, and even the suspect himself. Because by the time the truth finally emerged, the man investigators had been searching for was no longer alive to answer a single question. What happened inside that apartment wasn't just another unsolved homicide. It became one of Sacramento County's greatest investigative mysteries, a case that tested the limits of science, patience, and the determination of people who refused to let a victim be forgotten. And at the center of it all was a young woman whose future seemed brighter than ever. Nancy Bennallack wasn't living recklessly. She wasn't involved in dangerous circles or leading a life that attracted attention. Friends remembered her as thoughtful, dependable, and deeply committed to the people she loved. She had a respected career as a court reporter, spending her days documenting legal proceedings with precision and professionalism. Her work demanded accuracy, patience, and composure, qualities that those around her believed reflected her personality as well. But what truly defined that season of her life wasn't her profession. It was anticipation. She was engaged. Only weeks remained before she would walk down the aisle and begin a new chapter with the man she loved. Wedding plans filled conversations. Friends and family were looking ahead to a celebration, not a tragedy. No one imagined that those plans would never become reality. Like countless evenings before it, the night began quietly. There were no public arguments, no reported threats, no indication that danger was approaching. Everything about the evening suggested an ordinary end to an ordinary day. Yet somewhere nearby, someone else's plans were unfolding. Whether driven by opportunity, intent, or impulse, remains one of the many questions history can never fully answer. What investigators would later discover, however, suggested that whoever entered Nancy's apartment was willing to take enormous risks. Not only did the intruder choose a second-floor residence, but he also left behind evidence that should have identified him almost immediately. And still, he vanished. As dawn broke over Sacramento the following morning, people started their routines just as they always had. Courtrooms prepared for another day. Clerks arrived at work. Attorneys organized their case files. But there was one person who never showed up. At first, it may not have seemed alarming. Delays happen. Traffic happens. Unexpected events happen. But those who knew Nancy understood something important. She wasn't careless. She wasn't someone who simply disappeared without explanation. As concern grew, the ordinary rhythm of the morning slowly transformed into something much darker. Soon, worried calls turned into urgent visits. And before long, authorities would enter an apartment that would remain frozen in investigators' memories for decades. Inside, they found evidence of a violent struggle, but also something else, something remarkably rare. The person responsible had injured himself. In trying to escape, he had unknowingly left behind traces of his own blood. For detectives in 1970, it seemed like the breakthrough every investigator hopes for. Surely, they thought, this would lead them to the killer. But there was one devastating problem. The science capable of unlocking that evidence had not yet been invented. The blood was there. The answers were there. The identity was there. Yet for decades, it would remain nothing more than an unanswered mystery, waiting for technology to catch up. The evidence would sit silently inside an evidence locker while the world changed around it. Children grew into adults. Investigators retired. Families mourned. Entire generations came and went. And all the while, the person responsible continued living a life no one questioned. Or did they? Because buried deep within the original investigative files was a name that detectives had encountered almost immediately. A man who lived astonishingly close to Nancy. He had spoken with investigators. He had answered questions. Then, like so many others interviewed during those early days, he faded into the background. At least, that's what everyone believed. More than 50 years later, advances in science would reopen the door that had remained closed for decades. A single biological clue would begin telling a story that investigators in 1970 could never have imagined. If you were to ask the people who knew Nancy Bennallack to describe her in one word, many would likely choose reliable. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, nor someone who constantly sought attention. Instead, she had earned the quiet respect of those around her through consistency, kindness, and a strong sense of responsibility. Whether at work or among friends, Nancy was known as someone people could depend on. Born into a close-knit family, Nancy was raised with values centered on hard work, integrity, and compassion. Those qualities stayed with her into adulthood, shaping both her career and the relationships she built. Friends remembered her as warm, thoughtful, and optimistic, a woman who genuinely believed the future held good things. By 1970, Nancy had established herself professionally as a court reporter for Sacramento County. It was a demanding position that required exceptional concentration and precision. Every spoken word inside the courtroom had to be captured accurately, often during emotionally charged legal proceedings. Court reporters rarely receive public recognition, but their work is vital to the justice system. They create the official record that judges, attorneys, and appellate courts rely upon. It is a profession built on discipline and trust, qualities Nancy displayed every day. Ironically, she spent her working hours helping preserve the truth inside courtrooms. Years later, it would take another courtroom-related investigation to uncover the truth about what happened to her. Outside of work, Nancy's life was entering what many consider one of life's happiest seasons. She was engaged to Ferris Salami, Sacramento County's chief public defender. The couple shared a deep commitment to one another, and those close to them described their relationship as loving and stable. Wedding plans were well underway, and excitement was building among family members and friends. Like many engaged couples, they spent time discussing their future, not just the wedding itself, but the life they hoped to build afterward. Conversations revolved around ordinary dreams, a home together, shared routines, family gatherings, holidays, and the countless milestones that lie ahead for two people preparing to begin married life. Everything suggested that Nancy was exactly where she wanted to be. She had meaningful work. She had supportive family and friends. She had found someone she loved, and in only a matter of weeks, she expected to begin an entirely new chapter. She lived alone in a second-floor apartment on Arden Way in Sacramento. It was a quiet residential complex, not a place where residents constantly feared for their safety. Like many apartment communities, neighbors recognized one another casually, exchanged greetings, and generally assumed the environment was secure. Nancy had settled comfortably into her home. It reflected the life of a young professional, organized, welcoming, and peaceful. There was nothing extraordinary about it, and perhaps that was exactly why she felt safe there. One small habit, however, would later become one of the most discussed details of the investigation. Nancy owned a cat. To give the pet freedom to come and go, she occasionally left her sliding glass balcony door partially open during the evening. At the time, it seemed harmless. Many pet owners still make similar accommodations today, never imagining that such an ordinary routine could create an unexpected vulnerability. There is no evidence that Nancy believed she was in danger. She wasn't changing her routines. She wasn't confiding fears to friends. She wasn't preparing for a confrontation with anyone. By every available account, life was moving forward exactly as she had planned. And that normalcy is one of the reasons this case continues to resonate with so many people decades later. Nancy wasn't caught in a high-profile conflict. She wasn't living under public scrutiny. She was simply a young woman pursuing a career, preparing for marriage, and looking forward to the future. It's a reminder that many victims of violent crime are not targeted because of who they are. Sometimes they simply find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, a reality that can make these cases especially difficult for families to understand. As investigators later examined Nancy's life, they searched for anything that might explain why she had been attacked. Did she have enemies? Had anyone threatened her? Was there a dispute at work? Had she noticed someone following her? Friends, relatives, co-workers, and acquaintances were interviewed extensively. Detectives looked for conflicts, personal grudges, financial issues, and relationship problems. Again and again, they reached the same conclusion. Nothing in Nancy's known life pointed toward an obvious motive. The absence of a clear explanation only deepened the mystery. Investigators were left asking difficult questions. Had the offender specifically targeted Nancy, or had he simply noticed an opportunity? Was the apartment selected because of who lived there, or because of how accessible it appeared? Those questions would remain unanswered for decades. Meanwhile, the people who loved Nancy struggled with an entirely different reality. Instead of attending a wedding, they were planning a funeral. Instead of celebrating new beginnings, they were trying to comprehend a heartbreaking loss that seemed impossible to explain. For her fiancé, the emotional burden was especially profound. Only hours earlier, they had been making ordinary memories together. Neither of them could have imagined that their final goodbye would become exactly that, the last time they would ever see one another. Investigators would naturally examine every aspect of their relationship, as they do in virtually every homicide investigation. Yet, as the evidence developed, nothing suggested his involvement. Instead, he became another grieving loved one, searching desperately for answers alongside Nancy's family. As the investigation expanded, detectives shifted their focus outward, from the people closest to Nancy to the apartment complex itself. Who had been nearby that night? Who knew the layout of the building? Who could have approached the second-floor balcony without attracting attention? The search for those answers would lead investigators to dozens of interviews, hundreds of leads, and one resident whose name would quietly enter the case file before fading into obscurity for more than 50 years. At the time, there was no reason to believe that this ordinary interview would eventually become one of the most significant moments in the history of the investigation. But what investigators discovered next would shock an entire community. Before we continue, if you believe every victim deserves to have their story remembered, consider subscribing. On October 25, 1970 began like countless Sundays before it. There were no ominous warnings, no frantic phone calls, no indication that the day would end in tragedy. For Nancy Bennallack, it was simply another day spent balancing work, relationships, and the excitement of an approaching wedding. As the sun slowly dipped below the Sacramento skyline, Nancy's attention turned away from the demands of everyday life and toward the person who mattered most to her, her fiancé, Ferris Salami. The two spent part of the evening together, enjoying what friends would later describe as an ordinary visit between a couple preparing for marriage. They talked, relaxed, and shared the quiet comfort that comes from knowing someone so well. There were no reports of conflict or tension. Nothing suggested this evening would be remembered as their last together. Around 11:30 p.m. that night, Ferris drove Nancy back to her apartment on Arden Way. Like many couples nearing their wedding day, they likely believed tomorrow would bring another opportunity to continue planning their future. Neither of them knew they had already shared their final goodbye. Ferris watched Nancy safely enter her apartment before leaving for his own home. To him, everything appeared perfectly normal. That detail would become important later. Investigators carefully reconstructed the timeline and found no evidence that anyone followed them to the apartment. There were no reports of suspicious vehicles trailing behind them. No witnesses recalled seeing anyone waiting outside the building. Whoever would later enter Nancy's apartment either arrived independently or was already somewhere nearby. As midnight approached, the apartment complex settled into silence. Lights gradually disappeared behind curtains. Residents locked their doors. The sounds of passing traffic became less frequent. For most people living there, it was just another peaceful Sacramento night. Inside her apartment, Nancy prepared to settle in. She had every reason to believe tomorrow would unfold like every other Monday. She would wake up, get ready for work, and return to the courthouse where colleagues expected to see her. But one familiar routine quietly altered the security of her home. Nancy's cat enjoyed moving between the apartment and the balcony. To accommodate the pet, Nancy sometimes left the sliding glass door slightly open. It wasn't unusual. Many neighbors likely wouldn't have thought twice about doing the same thing. After all, this was a second-floor apartment. Reaching that balcony would require effort, confidence, and a willingness to be seen. Most people would assume that alone was enough to discourage an intruder. Unfortunately, assumptions don't always reflect reality. Sometime after Nancy settled in for the night, someone approached the apartment complex. Whether this individual had been watching the building, whether he knew Nancy, or whether he simply recognized an opportunity, those questions remain unanswered. What investigators do know is that the offender reached the second-floor balcony. That single fact has fascinated detectives for decades. Climbing to a second-story balcony is not something most criminals attempt on impulse. It involves risk. A passerby could notice. A neighbor could hear unusual movement. A resident could switch on a light at any moment. Yet whoever climbed onto that balcony appeared willing to accept those risks. The question is, why? Was Nancy specifically chosen, or was the apartment selected because the balcony door appeared vulnerable? Even today, investigators cannot answer with complete certainty. One of the most enduring mysteries surrounding this case isn't simply who committed the crime, it's why Nancy became the victim. As detectives later reviewed every aspect of her personal and professional life, they found remarkably little to suggest she had been intentionally targeted by someone she knew. There were no documented threats, no known stalkers, no significant personal disputes, no evidence of ongoing harassment. The lack of an obvious motive forced investigators to consider another possibility. Could this have been a crime of opportunity? If so, it was one with devastating consequences. Meanwhile, inside the apartment, nothing indicated that Nancy expected anyone to enter. There is no evidence she invited a late-night visitor. No signs suggested she had arranged to meet someone after returning home. The evening's timeline remained straightforward. She had spent time with her fiancé, she returned home, she settled in for the night. Then, sometime in the darkness, everything changed. As investigators later pieced together the sequence of events, one conclusion became increasingly clear. The offender had likely entered through the partially open sliding balcony door. It was an entrance that bypassed the apartment's main doorway entirely. For detectives, this detail immediately shifted the investigation. Instead of asking who might have been welcomed inside, they now had to determine who was capable of entering without permission. That distinction dramatically widened the scope of the case. Neighbors, maintenance workers, former residents, delivery personnel, visitors. Anyone familiar with the apartment complex suddenly became relevant to investigators. Hundreds of interviews followed. Every lead, no matter how small, was documented. Every name was considered. Some would be eliminated quickly. Others would linger in the investigative files for years. One of those names belonged to a man who lived within the same apartment complex. At the time, he appeared to be just another resident interviewed during the early stages of the investigation. Nothing tied him conclusively to the crime. Nothing allowed detectives to move forward. And so, like many other leads, his name slowly faded into the background. What no one realized was that the truth had already brushed past investigators. It simply lacked the scientific tools needed to reveal itself. As the night progressed toward morning, the quiet apartment complex remained unaware that one of Sacramento County's most enduring mysteries had just unfolded within its walls. In only a few hours, concerned coworkers, worried loved ones, and determined detectives would begin asking the same question. Where is Nancy Bennallack? The search for that answer would uncover a crime scene unlike any investigators expected. A scene containing a clue so powerful that it would eventually rewrite the entire investigation. But in 1970, no one yet understood its true value. The morning of October 26, 1970, began like any other Monday in Sacramento. Courtrooms were preparing to open. Attorneys reviewed case files. Court reporters organized their notes for another day of proceedings. But there was one person who never arrived. Nancy Bennallack was known for being dependable. She wasn't someone who simply failed to show up without notice. As the morning progressed and there was still no word from her, concern began to spread among those who knew her. At first, the possibilities seemed ordinary. Perhaps she'd overslept. Perhaps her car had broken down. Perhaps an unexpected emergency had delayed her. But with each passing hour, those explanations became less convincing. Attempts were made to reach her. When those efforts failed, loved ones and authorities became increasingly concerned. Eventually, someone entered Nancy's apartment. Instead of finding a woman getting ready for work, they discovered a scene that immediately made it clear this was no accident and no medical emergency. The apartment showed signs of a struggle. Investigators quickly secured the area and began treating it as a homicide scene. In 1970, crime scene processing looked very different from what viewers see in modern television dramas. Detectives relied heavily on careful observation, photographs, handwritten notes, witness interviews, fingerprints, and the collection of physical evidence that they hoped future laboratory testing could explain. Every inch of the apartment was examined: doors, windows, furniture, the balcony. Investigators weren't simply looking for what the offender had taken. They were trying to understand how he had entered, how long he had remained inside, and perhaps most importantly, what mistakes he had made. Then came the discovery that immediately captured investigators' attention. During the struggle, the intruder had apparently injured himself. He left behind drops of his own blood. For detectives, this was extraordinary. Blood belonging to the offender was rarely recovered at homicide scenes in that era. Even more remarkable, it suggested that the attacker hadn't escaped unscathed. Somewhere in Sacramento, investigators believed there was a man carrying a fresh injury, someone who might suddenly need medical attention, explain away unexplained cuts, or behave differently in the days that followed. Detectives immediately recognized the potential value of that evidence. Unfortunately, the technology of the time imposed harsh limitations. DNA profiling did not yet exist. There was no national database, no genetic genealogy, no rapid forensic comparison capable of identifying an unknown individual from a few drops of blood. The evidence could be preserved, but not fully understood. Still, investigators refused to let the case grow cold. They canvassed the neighborhood extensively. Residents were interviewed one after another. Every unusual sighting was documented. Every suspicious person was noted. Detectives worked to reconstruct the hours before and after the crime, hoping that someone had seen a stranger moving through the apartment complex during the night. Among the many people interviewed was a resident named Richard John Davis. At the time, he appeared to be one of many individuals who lived nearby. He answered investigators' questions just as others did. Nothing available in 1970 provided detectives with probable cause to arrest him or charge him with any offense. Under the legal standards required by the Fourth Amendment and California criminal procedure, investigators needed objective evidence connecting a suspect to the crime. Suspicion alone, even if someone lived nearby, was not enough, and so the investigation continued. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. Despite hundreds of interviews and countless hours of investigative work, no definitive suspect emerged. The blood evidence remained the case's greatest mystery. Investigators knew it belonged to someone. They simply had no way to determine who. As the years passed, forensic science advanced dramatically. In the 1980s and 1990s, DNA profiling transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Suddenly, biological evidence collected decades earlier became incredibly valuable. Sacramento County investigators revisited Nancy's case. The preserved blood sample was analyzed using modern DNA technology, and a DNA profile was successfully developed. For detectives, hope returned. The profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database used to compare DNA collected from crime scenes with DNA profiles from qualifying offenders and other cases. Then they waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. But the answer never came. No match. The DNA profile belonged to someone who wasn't in the database. Once again, the investigation reached a dead end. For many agencies, that might have been the end of the story. But Sacramento County investigators refused to give up. As forensic science continued evolving, another revolutionary tool emerged: forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA databases used in criminal investigations, this technique compares crime scene DNA with publicly available genealogy data from individuals who have voluntarily submitted DNA for family history research. Investigators then build family trees, gradually narrowing the search until a likely individual is identified. The approach has helped solve numerous cold cases while operating under legal procedures and judicial oversight where required. For Nancy's case, this breakthrough changed everything. Investigators partnered with forensic genealogy specialists. Piece by piece, relative by relative, generation by generation, the unknown DNA began pointing toward one family. From there, the family tree narrowed until one name stood out: Richard John Davis. The same man detectives had interviewed shortly after Nancy's death, the same man who had quietly disappeared into the background of the investigation. The evidence suggested investigators had encountered the future suspect almost immediately after the crime. But in 1970, science simply wasn't capable of proving what the biological evidence would reveal more than 5 decades later. There was, however, one final and deeply bittersweet twist. When investigators confirmed the identification, Richard John Davis had already been dead for many years. There would be no dramatic arrest, no interrogation, no courtroom testimony, no opportunity to ask the questions Nancy's family had carried for more than half a century. The identity of the offender had finally been uncovered. But justice, in its traditional legal sense, had slipped away long before science caught up. For more than 50 years, Nancy Bennallack's case remained one of Sacramento County's oldest unsolved homicides. Detectives came and went. Technology evolved. Entire investigative teams inherited boxes of reports, photographs, handwritten notes, and preserved evidence, each hoping they would be the ones to uncover what others could not. One principle united them all: they refused to let Nancy's case become forgotten. By the early 2020s, investigators believed they had exhausted nearly every traditional investigative method available. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Some individuals connected to the original investigation had passed away. Yet one thing had endured: the biological evidence collected in 1970. It had been preserved with extraordinary care, waiting for a scientific breakthrough that no one could have imagined when the investigation first began. Working with forensic genetic genealogy specialists, detectives began reconstructing family relationships connected to the unknown DNA profile recovered from the crime scene. Unlike conventional DNA comparisons, this process required patience and meticulous research. Genealogists examined distant relatives, historical records, census information, birth certificates, marriage records, and family trees, gradually narrowing thousands of possibilities into a single investigative path. Eventually, every road pointed toward one individual: Richard John Davis. To investigators, the discovery was both astonishing and frustrating. Astonishing because the evidence had finally identified the person responsible. Frustrating because his name had existed inside the investigation from the very beginning. He had lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy. He had been interviewed during the original investigation. But investigators in 1970 simply lacked the forensic tools necessary to connect him to the biological evidence left at the scene. Before publicly announcing their findings, detectives followed one final investigative step. Rather than relying solely on genealogical analysis, they sought independent confirmation through additional DNA comparisons involving Davis's biological relatives. This verification was essential to ensure the identification met the rigorous evidentiary standards expected in a homicide investigation. Only after those results supported the conclusion did the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office officially announce that Richard John Davis had been identified as Nancy Bennallack's killer. For many observers, one immediate question followed. If investigators finally knew who committed the crime, why wasn't anyone arrested? The answer lies in one of the most fundamental principles of criminal law. A criminal prosecution can proceed only against a living defendant. By the time investigators identified Davis through forensic genetic genealogy, He had died in 1997 from causes unrelated to Nancy's murder. Legally, the case had reached an unusual conclusion. Investigators had identified the offender beyond what they believed to be a reasonable investigative standard, but the criminal justice system could no longer exercise jurisdiction over him. No arrest warrant could be executed, no indictment could be pursued, no arraignment could take place. There would be no preliminary hearing to determine probable cause. No jury would hear evidence, no prosecutor would deliver a closing argument, no defense attorney would challenge forensic testimony, and no judge would pronounce guilt or impose a sentence. Some viewers may wonder whether investigators could have officially declared Davis guilty. The answer is no. Under the American legal system, guilt in a criminal case is determined only through lawful judicial proceedings or a valid guilty plea. Because Davis died before prosecution, no court could render a criminal verdict. Instead, law enforcement announced that its investigation had concluded Richard John Davis was responsible based on the totality of the evidence, particularly the DNA evidence and the genealogy analysis that identified him. That distinction is important. An investigative conclusion is not the same as a judicial conviction. Even so, many legal experts have observed that the identification demonstrates the growing power of forensic science to resolve cases that once seemed impossible to solve. Nancy's case joined a growing list of historic cold cases solved through forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that has transformed homicide investigations across the United States. Cases that had sat untouched for decades suddenly became solvable because biological evidence preserved years earlier could finally reveal names instead of mysteries. For Nancy's family, however, the scientific achievement was deeply personal. For over 5 decades, they had lived with unanswered questions. Who did this? Why Nancy? Could the person responsible still be alive? Would they ever know the truth? Those questions shaped birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and family gatherings for more than half a century. When investigators finally provided an answer, it could never restore what had been taken. It could never give Nancy the life she had been preparing to begin. It could never replace the wedding that never happened, or the future her loved ones had imagined for her. But it did end one painful chapter. Instead of living with uncertainty, her family finally knew who had entered Nancy's apartment that October night. They knew investigators had never stopped working, and they knew that advances in science had accomplished what once seemed impossible. Although there was no courtroom verdict, many relatives expressed appreciation that Nancy's name had not been forgotten, and that those responsible for preserving the evidence had remained committed to finding the truth. For the detectives who inherited the case decades after the original investigation, the announcement represented something equally significant. It demonstrated that no cold case is truly frozen if evidence remains. Sometimes justice arrives quickly, sometimes it takes months, sometimes years, and sometimes it takes more than half a century. But the pursuit itself never truly ends. The story of Nancy Bennallack's case is therefore not only about a homicide investigation, it is also about perseverance, about evidence preserved with care, about investigators who refused to surrender to time, and about a scientific revolution that gave a voice to evidence that had remained silent for generations. The legal process may never have unfolded inside a courtroom. Yet the truth eventually emerged from the smallest traces left behind on one October night in 1970. And in the end, that truth changed everything, more than 50 years. That's how long Nancy Bennallack's name remained attached to one of Sacramento County's oldest unsolved homicide investigations. For some, that number represents an extraordinary police investigation. For others, it represents the remarkable evolution of forensic science. But for Nancy's family, it represents more than 5 decades of unanswered questions, a future that never arrived, and a loved one whose absence was felt every single day. When people hear stories like Nancy's, it's easy to become captivated by the mystery, the DNA, the decades-long investigation, the technological breakthrough, the dramatic identification of a suspect. Those are compelling elements, but they should never overshadow the person at the center of the story. Nancy Bennallack was not simply a cold case. She was a daughter, a fiancée, a trusted colleague, a friend. A young professional who had dedicated her career to helping preserve the integrity of the justice system. Ironically, she spent her days ensuring that courts accurately recorded the truth. It would take more than half a century before science finally recorded the truth about what happened to her. Although no criminal trial ever occurred, investigators ultimately accomplished something that once seemed impossible. They gave Nancy her name back. For decades, newspaper headlines described an unsolved murder. Today, history remembers it differently, as a case that demonstrated what persistence, careful evidence preservation, and scientific advancement can achieve when investigators refuse to stop searching for answers. It also serves as a reminder that justice does not always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes justice means a conviction. Sometimes it means a sentence handed down in a courtroom. And sometimes justice is simply replacing uncertainty with truth. For Nancy's family, learning the identity of the person responsible could never erase decades of grief. It could never return the birthdays missed, the holidays left incomplete, the wedding that never took place, or the life Nancy never had the opportunity to live. But knowing the truth allowed a painful question to finally be answered. And sometimes that answer is the only form of closure time can still provide. This case also highlights an often overlooked reality about criminal investigations. Evidence matters. The biological evidence collected in 1970 was preserved by investigators who had no way of knowing how future technology would evolve. At the time, they couldn't perform DNA profiling. They couldn't search national databases. They couldn't build genetic family trees. Yet they understood something essential: protect the evidence. Because someday, science may know what we do not. That decision became one of the defining reasons this case was eventually solved. It is a lesson that continues to influence homicide investigations across the United States today. Every carefully collected sample, every documented photograph, every preserved piece of evidence may one day become the key that unlocks the truth. Nancy's case also offers practical lessons for all of us, not to encourage fear, but to promote awareness. Many serious crimes occur during moments that feel completely routine. A familiar neighborhood, a normal evening, a daily habit. Most routines pass without incident, but reviewing our personal security from time to time can reduce unnecessary risks. Simple habits, such as ensuring doors and windows are fully secured before going to bed, checking that entry points are locked, maintaining exterior lighting where possible, and staying aware of unusual activity around our homes can strengthen everyday safety. These precautions are not guarantees, nor should they lead us to blame victims when crimes occur. Responsibility always lies with the offender, but thoughtful security practices can help reduce opportunities for unlawful entry and support personal safety. Communities also play an important role, looking out for neighbors, reporting suspicious behavior when appropriate, supporting local law enforcement investigations, and remembering that even seemingly insignificant observations can become valuable pieces of a much larger puzzle. Finally, Nancy Bennallack's story reminds us why cold case units exist. A case may grow old, evidence may gather dust, witnesses may move away, but the pursuit of truth should never have an expiration date. Behind every cold case file is a family still hoping for answers, a detective who refused to give up, and a victim whose story deserves to be remembered with dignity. As forensic science continues to advance, more families may one day receive the answers they have waited decades to hear. Nancy's story stands as proof that time can delay the truth, but it does not always prevent it. Thank you for watching. If Nancy Bennallack's story moved you, consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this documentary. Not simply because it tells the story of one remarkable investigation, but because every time a cold case is remembered, it honors the victim and reinforces an important message: no victim should ever be forgotten. No unanswered question should be dismissed simply because years have passed. And no pursuit of justice should end while the truth is still waiting to be found. For Nancy Bennallack, the journey to that truth lasted more than half a century. Her voice was silenced in 1970. But thanks to determined investigators, preserved evidence, and advances in forensic science, her story continues to speak. Every case leaves behind questions, and sometimes more than one possible explanation. Now I'd like to hear from you. What do you think really happened? Do you agree with the investigators' conclusions, or is there something that doesn't quite add up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many of them as I can, and some of the best discussions happen there. If you enjoy deeply researched, true crime documentaries that treat every victim's story with the care and respect it deserves, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a new investigation. And if you're not ready to leave just yet, click the video that's now on your screen. It's another gripping case filled with twists, unanswered questions, and shocking revelations. I'll see you there.